Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I am so excited to welcome you to today's program, Nazis on Long Island, the story of Camp Siegfried. I would like to thank the New York City College of Technology, who will be opening an exhibition entitled Americans and the Holocaust in 2023, and the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County for co-presenting today's program. Joining us today are Bess Wohl, Arnie Bernstein, and Bradley W. Hart. They will be in conversation with Randi F. Marshall. Bess Wohl is a playwright whose works include Grand Horizons, which was nominated for the Tony Award for Best Play, Make Believe, which was a New York Times critic pick, and Small Mouth Sounds, which was on numerous top 10 lists. Her most recent play is Camp Siegfried, which had its world premiere at the Old Vic in London in 2021. Arnie Bernstein is the author of Swastika Nation, Fritz, Kuhn, and the Rise and Fall of the German-American Bund. He is a nonfiction author and writing teacher based in Chicago. Arnie has spoken about the Bund on MSNBC, the National Geographic Channel, NPR, and other national and international media. This summer, he will be featured in the documentary The American Führer for German public television. Bradley W. Hart is an assistant professor at California State University, Fresno. His books include George Pitt Rivers and the Nazis, The Foundations of the British Conservative Party, Essays on Conservatism from Lord Salisbury to David Cameron, which he co-edited with Richard Carr, and Hitler's American Friends, the Third Reich Supporters in the United States. Randi F. Marshall is a member of the editorial board at Newsday. She has covered the economy, biotechnology, and a host of other business issues on Long Island and in New York City. After 8 years on Newsday's investigations team, she joined the editorial board in 2015. During the discussion, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm now going to hand things over to Randi.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much, Sydney, and thank you. It's a real honor to be here today and to be joined by such an esteemed panel. If my panelists could turn their cameras on and unmute themselves, I'd love to be able to have everybody see their smiling faces as well. And it's really telling to me that we're having this conversation today, just a few days after the horrific events at the synagogue in Texas and in the climate that we are in. So I hope to be able to talk about that as well. But to start, I'd like to take everybody back to the mid-1930s. And into Yaphank, which is on the eastern part of Long Island. And Arnie, I want to start with you. Talk to me a little bit about what Yaphank was like back then, and how this camp, where this camp came from, and what life was like at Camp Siegfried. What did it look like? What did it feel like? What it was like for the youth that were there?
Sure. Well, Yaphank was well known. One of Irving Berlin's early shows was Yip Yip Yaphank, and so it was a well-known community on Long Island. The Bund camp actually was an outgrowth of, and the whole Bund was an outgrowth of something called the Friends of New Germany, which Fritz Kuhn, who was the leader of the German-American Bund, as they went out, he took over. What they would do is, it looked like any other kind of family camp. Nice, grounds, athletic areas, camper, cabins, things like that, places where people could gather, except it had the Nazi twist. There, everywhere you look, there was a swastika on the flower beds, on the flags, things called Adolf Hitler Street, Goebbels Street, things like that. There were, a lot of things were in German. The Nazi flag would fly higher than the American flag, so everybody knew, what was going on. There was it was largely for New Yorkers, and they would come in on something called the Camp Siegfried Special. It was a train coming from New York right into Yaphank, and they would march through on Main Street. They would march through to go to Camp Siegfried. The neighbors and people in Yaphank did not like them. There were, in fact, the Bundists, they didn't just confine themselves to the grounds of the camp. They would also, neighbors complained that they were digging around in flower beds or ripping out strawberry patches, things like that. They didn't like them there, to say the least.
Yeah, seriously. Brad, talk to us about how the camp came to be and why. It was started by Fritz Kuhn. What did he offer up? What was the purpose? How did it come to be, and how did it fit with the broader efforts to promote Nazi ideology in America?
So Fritz Kuhn is this really fascinating figure that's almost been lost from the history books, but as I present him in my book, certainly is this incredibly disturbing figure. He is himself an immigrant from Germany, immigrated initially to Mexico in the 1920s, and then to Detroit, where he worked for the Ford Motor Company for a period of time, and was supposedly fired from that job for practicing his political speeches in the workplace. But Kuhn presents himself as an old fighter of the Nazi Party. He actually claims that he was with Hitler during the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, and ends up sort of exiled, as many supporters of the early Nazi Party were, either by law or by sort of self-exile. So Kuhn is this radicalized figure already. As Arnie mentioned, I mean, initially he's involved in a group called Friends of the New Germany, which is supposedly a German-American heritage group, but of course has this very politicized extremist bent to it. That group eventually is shut down. The German-American Bund results as sort of the successor organization, and Kuhn becomes its sort of national chairman. So Kuhn is actually a nationally known figure. Again, it's in some ways remarkable that he is almost entirely forgotten today. One of the reasons I wrote my book was because when I was teaching this period in American history classes, none of these figures showed up, none of these names except really Charles Lindbergh, who was not involved in the Bund, but involved in, of course, the America First Committee. So for Kuhn, emulating the Nazi Party in the United States really involves emulating what it has done in Germany. And so physical camps, the idea of sending people to a physical place where they can commiserate in their politics and in their shared heritage is essential. And so Kuhn develops this idea that the Bund needs a physical presence across the United States. And Camp Siegfried is really the hallmark, the sort of benchmark for what exists elsewhere. But Kuhn develops a very effective and an impressive real estate portfolio across the United States. So the way they use this camp is really as a showpiece for not only their New York members, which was probably the largest branch of the Bund, but also for visiting dignitaries from Nazi Germany. So this one spot in Long Island becomes a sort of internationally known place for extremists.
An interesting thing for Long Island to be known for at the time. Bess, you've written a play that depicts a very vivid picture of this camp. I found myself imagining what it was like to be one of those youth in that environment at that moment in reading it. And what struck me is that the youth that were there became fully involved in German culture, even as they're there in America on Long Island. Tell us what you found and why the camp became such a focal point for you in writing the play, and what the camp was like for these youth that became the main characters of the work that you did.
Well, I had never heard of this camp before. As Bradley said, it had never been taught to me. It was totally unknown to me, this chapter in American history. And so I first stumbled upon it, actually. I'm a playwright, I'm not a historian. So I was living in Bellport, and I sort of was researching the area a little bit. This was the first summer of the pandemic. And I looked around and I sort of Googled a little bit around the area, and I found that there had been this camp in Yaphank, and I really couldn't believe it because I started looking at images, and I felt like I was looking at images of Nazi Germany, and yet they were on Long Island. There was like a complete disconnect cognitively in terms of being able to process that this was America. As I dug in more, I felt that this story really needed to be told and that people needed to know about it. And I focused on, my play focuses on two characters, a 16-year-old girl and a 17-year-old boy. And they're spending the summer at the camp. And there's this sort of really sort of strange and upsetting tension between the activities, which seem incredibly idyllic, sailing, cookouts, all of this sort of embrace of nature, and the underlying ideology, which is, obviously horrifying and incredibly destructive. And the play really looks at how young people become indoctrinated, why they do, and hopefully ultimately offers a message of, what we can do to combat some of these really hateful forces in our society.
Yeah, and we're going to get to some of that messaging because I think that's really important about how we reflect on it today. Brad, I found one of the things that I found in your book and some of my own research is the sort of juxtaposition of this German camp, this Nazi ideology funneling through it. And yet there they are celebrating the 4th of July. Talk to me about how this fit into Americana, or how maybe Americana fit into it, and sort of the amazing juxtaposition of those two cultures in one place. And maybe in particular, I highlight that for us, that 4th of July celebration that I know you worked on.
Yeah, what's really fascinating and disturbing about Fritz Kuhn is that he tries both visibly and ideologically to merge Americanism with Nazism. He overtly argues at various points that, and he says this actually in 1939 at a very famous rally at Madison Square Garden, that if George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were alive in the 1930s, they would certainly be Nazis. This is the claim that Fritz Kuhn makes. And so the imagery that you see at Camp Siegfried and these other Bund facilities, I mean, they had facilities all over the country, we should mention, combined the American flag with the swastika. They had American flags being carried next to swastikas in these parades. You would see the German flag being hoisted above the American flag, but they were very careful to sort of combine that idea together. And that, I think, is what makes Kuhn unique. I mean, you certainly see efforts from Italian fascists or Mussolini sympathizers to sort of argue that, but perhaps Mussolini's not that bad type thing. You see other Nazi sympathizers saying, oh, perhaps the US doesn't have a vested interest in entering the war in Europe. That's very much the Charles Lindbergh argument. But Kuhn's arguing something different. He's actually saying that Americanism and Nazism are compatible. And of course, anti-Semitism is deeply at the heart of that. I mean, if you look at the sort of banners that show up at Bund rallies, one of their key slogans is Free America. And by that, they overtly mean free America from supposed Jewish domination. So I think that's really what stood out to me with Kuhn versus all of these other extremist groups, even of that period, is this argument of not only does Nazi Germany not present a threat, but Nazi Germany has ideas that the US should import, that these are compatible sort of visions of the world.
Arnie, I want to hear your thoughts on that as well. But also, after you reflect on that, do me a favor, talk to me a little bit about the ugliness of the camp and sort of the ugly aspect underneath the surface as well, that I know you've reflected on a bit.
Sure. Well, first, regarding Fritz Kuhn, this was the middle of the Depression. If he had been a businessman, he would have been a genius, because he took this small organization, the Friends of New Germany, that was dying, and he turned it around and he made it a money-making venture. They had a lot of different businesses. They had their own publishing wing. They had branches across the country. In fact, the camp itself was owned by, it was a front organization, obviously, but it was owned by someone, not the German-American Bund, but the German-American Business League, something like that. And so he had this genius for it. If he had gone into a legit business, we might remember him a little better today than we do now. We talked about the camps, and Bess was talking about the tension between the kids and everything. Idyllically was what these camps look like. Here are these wonderful kids, and now you can find pictures on the internet easily of them, marching and enjoying, camp activities. But they were abused as well on many levels, and in many ways, these kids were victims. They were the ones who built the camps. They built why hire a union when you have a lot of teenagers to build things, and they work them hard, and when parents complained, they were countered with, well, fine, and you won't have anyone to protect you in the United States. We're the only ones who can protect you. In other words, shut up. In fact, parents were often not allowed on the grounds. They didn't want them to see, the Bund leadership didn't want them to see what was happening to their children. They would have marches in the middle of the night, and they would take these kids, put 30-pound packs on them, and they would have to march during the hot, summer days, and then in the middle of the night, they would deliberately pick trails that had a lot of brush, a lot of bramble. Kids would get scratched up. They couldn't complain. No good German would complain. They'd take them out in the middle of a field, and there'd be a bonfire. They'd sing Deutschland über alles. They'd sing the Horstwessel-Lied, which was the Nazi song named after a so-called martyr for the Nazi party. And Heil Hitler. There certainly wouldn't be any mention of Franklin Roosevelt other than Franklin Rosenfeld, which was his real Jewish name, as we all know. They were abused on a lot of levels, and one of the other levels was sexual abuse. There was a young woman there. Her name was Helen Voorhees, and when she thought she was a member of the Brooklyn branch, and she thought she was going to be this nice camp leader, like a Girl Scout leader or something. And the head of the youth group, the adult head, when he met with her, he started hitting on her. And she wasn't sure what was happening. This is 1937. Kids don't know like they do today. And he said, "Oh, you can't take it, can you?" When she got to the camps, there was open sexual abuse. They had put the boys' cabins and the girls' cabins within close proximity to each other. You got teenagers in the middle of summer. It's close proximity. Things are going to happen. But it was encouraged. It was based on the German baby policy, where in Nazi Germany, the kids were encouraged to have relations and produce good Aryan children, which is what the Bund wanted to do as well. Now, there was one girl, her name was Tilly Kosh, and she felt this was an abuse. So she started standing guard at night to keep the boys from coming over to the girls' camps. But she ended up getting sick from standing out there night after night after night. She first got pneumonia and then turned into pleurisy, and they wouldn't do a thing. They wouldn't do a thing to help her because no German was going to, in fact, the word sissy was, no German was going to be a sissy. And she got sicker and sicker, and she died as a result of this. Now that is a bad PR move to have, a camper die, and so they said she was this great martyr for the cause. They held a giant parade for her, a funeral cortege in Brooklyn with an honor guard and all this. And her father, who was a janitor of some modest means, paid for everything. Now, years in 1939, when what became the House On-American Activities Committee was investigating the Bund, they had first called Fritz Kuhn, which is quite something. But then they had this Helen Voorhees come and speak, and she detailed everything that was happening. And it was horrific what these kids went through. In such, as I say, they were the victims as well.
Bess, I'm struck in your play how normal things seem for the first section until I guess they're not, right? And until the language changes and the atmosphere changes and scene by scene, you can almost see that shift. Can you talk about sort of how you created that contrast and how you saw that contrast to Arnie's point, right? On the one hand, this was this idyllic setting and these were, typical kids doing a typical Long Island camp, and on the other, it got dark really quickly. Can you talk a little bit about that contrast?
Yeah, I think part of what I was interested in exploring in the play was the way these sort of very ugly ideologies can kind of hide in plain sight, and this sense that things seem normal, but just under the surface, there's this really sort of hateful thing happening. So I was really interested in both the way the characters were seduced into this world, and also, because it's a play, taking the audience on that journey. Could I take the audience on a journey where they think they're watching one thing and then slowly the play becomes something else, and actually let them have the experience of being sort of indoctrinated. Theater has a quality of seduction and indoctrination sort of built into it. So, how much could that play upon the audience and become part of the experience of watching the play? And then by the end, of course, you're hit in the face with the horror, the absolute horror of what you've witnessed and what's happened to these characters and what these characters become, and you're left asking the question, as Arnie sort of mentioned, are they victims or are they perpetrators? And how much can we hold them responsible for their actions? And especially these 16 and 17-year-olds who are sort of on the cusp of figuring out who they are, and how fragile that moment is, and how it can go so awry if they, don't have the right role models and influences in their lives.
Brad, I'm struck by how vivid all of this is, and yet how little it seems the perhaps broader public knows about this history, this part of the history, and how little it is taught. Why do you think that is? Why is this not part of the discussion when we talk even about Nazi Germany or about the Holocaust? And do we need to do, I don't know, more to make sure that this is part of the discussion and that this history right here in America and right here on Long Island is discussed and understood better?
I think the answer to the second question is absolutely yes. I mean, that's why I've written my book. I'm sure that's why Arnie wrote his as well. I mean,
Yes.
This is a part of history that I think for many Americans is number one uncomfortable, because the sort of pervasive narrative of the Second World War is that the United States inevitably was going to join the side of the Allies. It was only a matter of time, and of course we were going to liberate Europe from the jackboot of Nazism. Not true at all. I mean, up until Pearl Harbor, isolationism, I argue, was the predominant political stance in Washington, D.C. There's even historical debate now in the past few years about what would have happened had Hitler not declared war on the United States. We often think that after Pearl Harbor, FDR declares war on both Germany and Japan. It's actually not true. Hitler declares war on the US after the US has declared war on Japan. So we have to understand and remember that this was a politically fraught time. And the other thing that really was remarkable to me is there were really no consequences for any of these individuals involved in this. After the war really ends, these people go on with their lives. I mean, the German-American Bund, I argue, had minimally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of members and sympathizers at its peak. I found very little evidence that many of them were prosecuted beyond the leaders. Some of them end up going to prison for various financial malfeasance, including actually Fritz Kuhn. But the vast majority of members face no consequences. If you look at the background check documents and security clearance documents the U.S. government was using in the late 40s, early 50s, the Bund was a prescribed organization. It would have prevented you from obtaining a security clearance, but there were really no other consequences for many of these people. And so I think, America very quickly wants to forget this history after the war ends, and by the late 40s, there's this incredible pivot towards sort of rooting out communist subversion, especially when you get into the McCarthy era in the early 50s. But there's really no effort that I was able to detect to hunt down the former members of these types of organizations. So I think it's in some ways, it's the American narrative we want to tell ourselves about the Second World War, but in some ways it's also a willful forgetting that there were many Americans, probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, that did not want the U.S. to enter Second World War and in fact rooted for its adversaries.
Arnie, to that point, talk to us about sort of what happened to the camp. What was the end of this story in terms of at least the camp and its outgrowth? How long was it there for? How did it end? And what happened in the aftermath? Brad just alluded to the fact that many of the people involved, there were no consequences. But what happened to these kids? What happened to the camp? How did it come to an end of sorts?
Yeah, before I do that, I just want to address something that Brad said. These were everyday people. They, nationwide, they first of all, they were terrible record keepers. Secondly, nobody's going to admit they were in such an organization. So it's really hard to say how many were in it. But there were camps nationwide. Siegfried was probably the largest, but there was also Camp Norland over in Jersey. There's Camp Hindenburg north of me in Milwaukee. But we were talking about the rally, the George Washington's birthday rally. There were 20,000 people inside of Madison Square Garden that night. They weren't all Bund members, obviously. They were everyday folks. Somehow they had to get these uniforms. Well, there were tailors to make them. There were tailors to make the flags. Somebody had to feed these people. They were your next door neighbors, in a sense. Now, the end of the camps. Well, when Fritz Kuhn went to jail, and they got him the same way they got Al Capone on taxes. They couldn't get him on free speech. You're right to be obnoxious in this country. But they found that they had something called the leadership principle, where you do whatever the leader says, and the leader's in charge of everything. Standard element of fascism. Well, he was also in charge of all the money, and nobody could say anything. He was, I guess you could say, he was the Nazi chick magnet. heavy set guy, heavy jowls, thick glasses, thick German accent, and he got women left and right. And they found he was using the money from the Bund to fund his romances. So in the end, they got him on embezzlement. Well, once they got him on embezzlement, that cut off the head of the dragon. And the Bund tried to get along for a few years after that, but there were various power struggles within who was left. And then a few days after Pearl Harbor, I mean, they were barely existing as it was, but a few days after Pearl Harbor, they officially came to an end. There was an insider who was actually feeding the FBI information on the Bund, and he gave them all the info on that final meeting. But the camps were dying as a result of, the whole Bund dying. There were various, I don't want to say raids, but there were people, police came on, local sheriff's departments, things like that. They found guns, they found pro-Nazi literature, they found things. In fact, this is actually kind of amusing. They found a notebook in one that said, in one of the camps, in someone's handwriting, said Charles Lindbergh would make a great president. Now, Philip Roth actually dealt with that in The Plot Against America, where he imagines Charles Lindbergh, and he actually talks about Fritz Kuhn in that book. I highly recommend it. And they just sort of petered out. They disappeared like a lot of the Bund people. The place in Wisconsin today, I've actually walked the grounds. It's quite beautiful, and it looked like anything else. And I know some people have walked through some of the other camps, not Siegfried, which I understand is just a community today, but they look like any kind of forest preserve. They just sort of faded, like, as Brett is saying, the war came and that was that. It's that simple. And I know it sounds simplistic, but it's also that simple.
No, it's true. What struck me in reading all of your books and in reading your play, Bess, is especially in reading the climactic scene in your play where the young woman is on the platform and speaking to the crowd. Her words are so familiar, right? She says, if foreign interests try to overtake America, we will not let them, we will prevail. I am sure that America can be great again. And I'm sure it was no accident perhaps that you wrote it that way, but talk to me about how you saw the environment of Camp Siegfried in today's lens. And I promise Brad and Arnie, you're gonna have a chance to talk about this, because this I think is a really important part of the conversation. But Bess, I want to start with you, because you were writing this already in the middle of the pandemic, in the era that we're in now. Talk to me about how you reflected on today's society when you thought about the camp.
Well, it was, again, this history was really new to me when I stumbled upon it. And one of the most striking things was how the rhetoric of the leaders of the camp, of Fritz Kuhn, really perfectly mirrored some of what I was hearing in the lead up to the election. And I started this play in the sort of the summer before the presidential election. So we were, obviously, it feels like we're still at a very tense moment, but we were at a very tense moment, part of our ongoing moment of tension, I guess. But, it really felt like America was in crisis, hanging in the balance, so many hate groups making their presence known with zero shame or, any sort of hiding of it. So it felt like it really resonated exactly with what was happening around me in a very terrifying way. And I felt, my play set in 1938. So there's a sense in my play of sort of being on the cusp of something horrible that is unimaginable to the characters within the play, especially a 16 and 17-year-old. So I was thinking, as I was writing the play in the lead up to the election, what are we on the cusp of? Like, and what does it feel like when you're on the cusp of something? And do you know, and what are the signs, and how do you know when you're headed to a very, very dark and terrible place? So that was one of the things that I was exploring. In the writing of the play, I almost felt like I had to tone down the connections to some of the current slogans that we were hearing in the media, because I felt like no one would believe it. No one would believe how similar this was. And in fact, some of the feedback on the play has been like, oh, that can't really be what it was. And it's one of those things as a playwright, sometimes when you represent reality, truthfully, it seems made up because reality is just so, difficult to accept sometimes. So that was, so yeah, it felt very sadly, tragically current to me as I was writing it. And that was part of the reason I was really wanting to write it.
Arnie, I want to hear from you on this too. Reflect similarly. How does that era and everything that the camp represented and that the youth experienced there reflect on where we are today, on some of the things that we've been through? I mean, the insurrection last year, what comes to mind. Talk to me about how you frame it when you think about it in today's lens.
Well, it's an interesting question. Before 2016, I would have given you a very different answer. But with the rise of what we've had of Trumpism, it's frightening how close it is to some of the things that Fritz Kuhn and his Bundists envisioned. They had something they called Der Tag, the day that was coming when Bolsheviks and Jews were going to take over the country, and they would have to fight back. Well, January 6th was Der Tag. And in fact, you find in a lot of these white supremacist groups, they were also talking about something called the day, or their version of it, where it was going to be necessary to fight back, to take over, before the government fell. Well, that's what happened. I mean, and there's no other way to put it. It's exactly what happened. It was Fritz Kuhn's dream come to life on January 6th. It's interesting because someone it was a justice of the peace in Yaphank who was terrified of these people. And he wrote to the local officials. He said, "We're going to have an insurrection." Well, he was right, but it came a few years later, but obviously. But he was right. And it was these people, the groups of today, they're in the inheritors of this. And in a sense, Fritz Kuhn is more foolish in that he put himself out there so much and wanted to be a public figure. He thrived on that publicity. He loved it. He was a real, he just loved the attention. But the groups of today, they were more underground. They have a way of clicking on the underground, through the dark web, QAnon, all these different factors that led to January 6th. We had all these disparate elements coming together, united. The German-American Bund, while they did have they would appear in like forums with the silver shirts, for example, and they did host some Klansmen at one of the camps after Kuhn was gone. But they weren't, it was more like friends, but they weren't connected as the groups are today. It's really frightening to think that we are living in a world where they've inherited the dream of Fritz Kuhn and the dream of the German-American Bund.
It's interesting as you're speaking, Arnie. I'm reflecting on what Fritz Kuhn and his efforts would have been like in the world of social media.
Oh yeah,
Kuhn had Twitter, right? Well, what would have happened? Brad, talk to me about your thoughts on this and sort of how you bring the research you did and the what you know of that time into today's lens.
Yeah, I think what's always stood out to me, and Arnie alluded to this earlier, is the absolute normalcy of many of the people who were involved in these things. I mean, these were in many ways average Americans, except that they were involved in the German-American Bund and had these extremist views. And I think, I started writing my book back in 2014, 2015, a very different context than when it was published in 2018, and a very different context than today when we're talking about it. And so that's been an interesting experience as an author to see my own work sort of evolving from sort of that wider perspective. But I think, this is what disturbs me about the situation we're in today is how well do we really know our next door neighbor? I mean, to the extent that these children, thousands of them, went to these camps in the 1930s and probably went on to live normal lives, ostensibly, right? We don't know what happened to the vast majority of them. I'll actually give you an example that's sort of relevant to me. As you heard in the intro, I'm a professor at California State University, Fresno. As a result of my book, we actually have a task force examining the name on our library because the person that it is named for is a person that I sort of exposed in my book as a Nazi sympathizer at Columbia University in this period. So this was a man that went on unknown to the vast majority of people and had a library named for him in California. So many of these people who held extremist views went on to seemingly normal lives. Some of them have buildings named after them. Some of them are now figures of ostensible veneration. And obviously as historians, we have a responsibility to discuss the things that people are, or the people that things are named after, and that sort of commemoration. But I think we also have to remember that these people were essentially invisible. There was almost no reckoning at all for these extremists. And we really don't know what happened to these people and what that sort of intellectual lineage looked like. So that's sort of the dark thought that keeps me awake at night, is what happened to these people, and what did they pass on to the next generation?
I'd be remiss, especially as a Newsday editorial writer and columnist who's been writing about Long Island, where we are today, a lot, if I didn't talk about Long Island specifically in today's realm a little bit. And I have two questions on this. First, I'll ask Arnie. Yaphank, this is not ancient history, right? Until very, very recently, Yaphank had provisions on its books where non-Germans could not buy real estate.
Right.
And there was a fair housing settlement only a few years ago, actually, that basically forced not all of Yaphank, but a piece of Yaphank that still was governed by these treaties to be able to allow folks to sell to non-Germans. And I guess I want you to reflect on sort of how that plays out, right? On a real estate level, on a neighborhood level, how perhaps this continues to, even today, to have ramifications and to have sort of a domino effect that would still affect these communities.
Right. Well, I mean, that's part of American history, unfortunately. There's always been restrictions that, we can't, there's a wonderful story, it may be apocryphal, about Groucho Marx trying to join a country club in California. And they said to him, sorry, you can't join, Mr. Marx, you're Jewish. Well, the one thing that took Groucho Marx aback, and he thought for a second, he said, well, my daughter's only half Jewish. Can she go in the water up to her waist? And, but these kinds of things have always existed. It's unfortunate, but it's really clubs you cannot join, things like that. It doesn't surprise me that those things happen. I mean, again, turning to Donald Trump and his father, settled out of court because they were having restrictions on who could move into their apartments, things like that. Woody Guthrie actually lived in a Fred Trump apartment, and wrote a song, Old Man Trump, about it. Well worth looking into it. It's quite a song. But there is one thing too. They were among us, but there were more good people fighting back, and that's really key to the story. As I said, there were 20,000 people inside of Madison Square Garden. Outside, there were an estimated 100,000 people who wanted to kill him. There were, and it was such a disparate organization. It was really fun to write about. You had Walter Winchell in New York, who went after Fritz Kuhn in a big way. You had LaGuardia and Dewey, who was then the prosecutor in New York, went after them. They were the ones who found the tax issues and the women issues. You had HUAC was formed in order to go after them and investigate the Bund. You had various Jewish groups looking into it, various socialist groups, everyday Americans, even the Jewish mafia, Meyer Lansky, Mickey Cohen, Lungi Zwillman in Jersey, a guy named Jack Rubenstein here in Chicago, who later changed his name to Jack Ruby, and understand he got involved in some other American history things. But even the Jewish mafia got involved in beating these guys up. It's quite a tale. And that was the thing. There were people out to stop it, and there were more good people out to stop it. And I would argue that today as well, there are more good people than there are these other elements. And that's what stops it from taking over.
And, I think that does speak to today as well. Bess, I should ask you, the other piece of this that reflected for me a lot in terms of Long Island and New York and where we are right now is that even some of our, anti-vaccine, anti-mask kind of protests have taken on a little bit of a flavor, right? Some of them have featured swastikas or there have been comparisons to Mengele, right, or things of that nature. There's been some Nazi symbolism there. Some of those groups have found a home in Suffolk County, not far from Yaphank in some cases, just as those Nazi sympathizers did. So I guess I'd ask you, how does that reflect, to Arnie's point and to some of what Brad has said, on how we combat it, right, and how we respond now in today's world to some of these protests and to some of what we're seeing, given what you've learned about our past?
Well, I love what Arnie just said, because it's easy, I think, especially right now, to feel a lot of despair and to, the hatred and anti-Semitism and racism in our society can be so loud that, the good people that are, trying to do their best every day and fight these forces can get kind of drowned out. So I really appreciate that reminder, Arnie, in the moments of despair. I really do. The morning after Donald Trump was elected, our neighborhood playground in Brooklyn, where my kids play, was graffitied with swastikas all over the kids, play structures. And it was, one of those moments where it's like, this is where my children play every day. But, we still play there, and we're still, there every day. And I think, in terms of what we can do, I think it's looking with honesty at ourselves, which I think is part of what this Camp Siegfried conversation is about, looking with honesty at who we are. But then it's also, aspiring to more, and then ultimately taking action, is so important. And, as a playwright writing a play, I don't imagine that that's the same as, a real social activism, but I do hope that, that's my way, that's my particular thing that I can offer in terms of how I can bring this conversation to people, and everyone's is different. And so I think it's for everyone, these amazing historians on the panel, whose books, by the way, I used for research in my writing of the play. So like, I'm a little starstruck to be with both of you. It's really offering what you can and figuring out what that is, and then doing it actively as much as possible.
Brad, I want to get to a few audience questions, but before I do you want to talk a bit about sort of how the past connects with the present, connects with the future, and some of what Arnie and Bess were just talking about?
Yeah, I want to echo both of them. I mean, this has been a great panel discussion, by the way. I mean, really enlightening and thought-provoking. But I thought Arnie made a great point, which is, the vast majority of people oppose this stuff. I cite all sorts of scary statistics in my book about, 35% of Americans think that Jews have too much financial power in the 1930s. Something like 10% of Americans say they would like Jews to be expelled from the country in the late 1930s. And even after the war starts, you have 2 or 3% of Americans who say they hope that Hitler wins the war. But when you look at the other side of that, even in the darkest days, 65% of people didn't support that. 98% of people want the United States to win the war. Even when Roosevelt is essentially hamstrung from providing aid to the British by the isolationists on Capitol Hill, a substantial number of Americans, not quite a majority, but high 40s, want to aid the Allies, even though it would violate the sort of American principle of neutrality. So I think we can't dwell purely on the darkness. I think the reason I wrote my book was to expose a moment in history that I thought was underexamined. But I think the other side of that is realizing that these people failed. The scariest figure who hasn't come up yet in this conversation is Father Charles Coughlin, right? Probably the most listened to radio host in history, openly anti-Semitic. No known ties to the Bund, at least in my research, but certainly ideologically adjacent. And yet even Charles Coughlin essentially fails to gain any serious political influence beyond sort of being a thorn in the side of Roosevelt. So at the end of the day, Hitler's American friends utterly failed. And I think that should all give us some hope.
I should point out, by the way, at the rally, they were selling buttons and things like that. They were selling copies of Charles Coughlin's Awake and Sing. Was that the name of it? They were selling copies of that, as well as Mein Kampf.
So we have a bunch of great audience questions, and I'm very grateful for what I know is an ongoing chat as we're talking, which I think is terrific. And I really look forward to hearing from some of those who are with us today. A couple of the questions are very similar, interestingly. One of our watchers today asks, is it possible to draw a direct line from the leaders of the Bund and the camps and contemporary neo-Nazi far-right hate groups, or is the heritage more diffuse or indirect? And somebody else asks whether there was a connection between the KKK and the German-American Bund. So I don't know, Brad, do you want to take that at all? Can we make any direct connections between some of our other hate groups, more contemporary hate groups, and those historic groups?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I get this all the time. I mean, so as Arnie sort of mentioned, I mean, the Bund disappears essentially overnight. We don't really know what happens to a lot of the members. Some of them may genuinely have just gotten out of politics entirely because they were German-American and didn't want to face the types of anti-German prejudice that actually the German-American community faced in World War I. So some of these people may have just gone quiet essentially, but what disturbs me, I mean, more than tracing the lineage, is the way that the Bund is now being appropriated by the extreme right. If you look at, and I do not recommend this personally, but if you look at far right forums, which I do for purely research purposes, obviously, you'll see Fritz Kuhn being invoked now. And you will see some of the people that I've written about who were forgotten figures at the time have now sort of gotten this second life where people are citing Kuhn's speeches about how the US has nothing to quarrel with Nazi Germany about as some sort of, overlooked fact of the past. And so I think we all have a responsibility to try to confront that. And that's certainly why I wrote my book. The Klan is interesting. I'll just keep my remarks brief. I'm sure Arnie and Bess have a lot to say about this, but the Klan and the Bund quarreled actually greatly. The one part of the country that the Bund doesn't really get any kind of a stronghold in is the South, partially because there's not a lot of German Americans down there necessarily, but the Klan also has this sort of stranglehold. And the Klan, which remember is also heavily anti-Catholic in this period. And actually the Bund has a number of Catholic members because Germany is traditionally 50% Catholic, 50% Protestant. So sort of the hatred between extremist groups is actually an interesting element of this too.
Arnie, do you want to talk to some of those connections a little bit?
Sure. I should point out, I went to high school in Skokie, Illinois at the time of the infamous Skokie March. I won't go into all the details of that. I'm sure many people know about it. They called themselves Nazis. They were a bunch of mopes is what they were. Are there connections? I think ideological connections. I don't know that they're, necessarily the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of these people, but ideologically they're connected. Certainly they have, things like Stormfront. I actually saw a discussion of my book on Stormfront, very minor, but my name was in big red letters, just in case anyone didn't understand that Arnie Bernstein was a Jewish name. They're out there. We saw the guy with the Camp Auschwitz hoodie. So again, somebody had to make that thing. They're connected. They're connected better today. Certainly Fritz Kuhn is invoked. When I was doing my research, there was a book I found, and I hesitate to call it a book. It was called They Too Were Americans. Two was all caps. And Brad, you saw the book? Yeah, and it's, it was all pictures and ephemera. It was really nicely put together, for what it was. There was barely a mention of Fritz Kuhn in it, interestingly enough, but because of his fall from grace, I suppose.
Bess, do we know at all? Have we seen any reporting or discussions of Camp Siegfried participants? Have they talked about their experience? Have any, I don't know, have you or anyone else even been able to talk to them or children or grandchildren, generations? Is there any firsthand accounting of the camp? One audience member wonders, what happened to them afterward, kind of thing. Do we know?
I searched for that a lot in my research and couldn't find firsthand accounts. So I looked more to, books like Arnie's and Bradley's, and also, looked to accounts of people who'd been in Hitler Youth and, who had been in Germany at the time, to sort of understand what it felt like to be a young person in that environment. But I don't know, maybe you guys found direct, accounts by people who'd been young at Camp Siegfried. I personally didn't.
Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, I will say I have not talked to anyone who actually was willing to talk. Although I say in every public appearance, I'll repeat it here. I mean, if anyone knows anyone who is involved in this, who wants to talk, I mean, certainly reach out. I have actually
reach out to me too. I'll do a Newsday piece.
Oh, fascinating. I've actually been reached out to by people who have found strange artifacts in their attics and things like that, including photos of Kuhn camps. People who have suspected after their parents or grandparents have passed away that they were potentially involved in these things. So I think my suspicion is that people just didn't talk about it. This was things that were put away, both mentally and physically. And now I think we actually are living at that generational shift where people are discovering this past really for the first time. And so I think in the next few years, we're going to see some really fascinating accounts of finding things literally in attics, but also sort of rediscovering this history. You can still find ephemera on eBay, things like that as well. Sometimes they're quick about taking a lot of that stuff off, but it's still out there. I didn't find anyone if they're out. In fact, there was one guy, a friend of his, who he was involved in fighting these guys on the streets. A friend of his tried to get him to talk to me. He was in his 90s. He didn't want to talk because he was still scared of potentially things that could happen to him. Now I've heard, I don't know how true this is, in some of the in a German part of Chicago, there's some of the bars in the back room on Hitler's birthday, they get together or something like that. How true that is, I don't know. I did meet, and this was years ago, I met a guy who had been in Hitler Youth as a kid. And when he got out after the war was over, he realized what he had participated in. And he was horrified. And he devoted the rest of his life to peace causes. He's a lovely man. And, I want to think that a lot of the kids did that. There was actually a former, what was called the OD, which was their version of the SS. A former member of the OD testified to the HUEC and said, I want to be a better American. I'm ashamed of what I've done. And they were very complimentary towards him.
Brad, what do we know about what the German Nazi Party knew about these American efforts? Did they support them in any way? Were they connected to them in any way? What audience member was there financing? What were the connections, if at all, between what Nazi Germany knew and Adolf Hitler knew and what was going on in America?
Well, this is actually a fascinating question, and it's one that we can't entirely answer. Some of this documentation related to the financing question is still being uncovered and digitized and things like that. But the Nazis Hitler himself is actually embarrassed by the Bund at various points. And one of the reasons that Friends of the New Germany fails is that they're afraid that this extremist group is going to present Franklin Roosevelt with a cause to declare war or to enter a war in Europe. So you have this sort of awkward relationship where certainly the German consulate and the German embassy in Washington are very aware of the Bund. It's front page news across the country at various points. And there probably is covert support financially or certainly privately, but ostensibly you have the German foreign ministry in Berlin saying, don't support these guys at all. They might be a liability. And so the Germans, and this is true for a host of extremist groups, including actually the America First Committee later on, and Charles Lindbergh and Father Coughlin, who we mentioned. But there's sort of the German foreign ministry is desperately afraid that these groups might present Roosevelt with an excuse to either declare war or enter a war, and so they want to stay fairly hands off. We should say that Fritz Kuhn and a Bund delegation does actually meet Hitler during the 1936 Olympics, and they get this sort of grainy sort of propaganda photo, very much unlike the types of PR material that the German foreign ministry and propaganda ministries generally put out. But Kuhn runs this on the front page of the Bund's paper and says, "Look, Hitler's appointed me the American Führer," type thing.
And if I could build on that,
please.
It was a grip and grin. It was they would march in, a standard political thing. Here's your Führer, you're going to meet this group, you're going to meet that group. So in comes the German-American Bund delegation. Hitler shakes his hand, he says, okay, so what are you doing? So this is what we're doing. And Hitler says, well, go back and continue your fight. Well, Kuhn said, Kuhn thought this was, the command on high, is really, okay, very nice, go back. And a couple of years afterwards, when it seemed like Germans were pushing them away. I mean, what you said, Brad, about them being embarrassed. I mean, I like saying in my lectures, imagine being a Nazi so bad you embarrass Hitler. But Kuhn went to try to get more support. And instead they met him. They said, we'll continue to give you propaganda, but we don't want anything to do with you otherwise. It was he thought he was going to meet somebody in the high command. He met a flunky, in essence. They sent a flunky to him. So when he came there, they shouted Sieg Heil at their rallies. But when he came back, of course, Kuhn, being the orator that he was, said, well, we're going to have some changes. And I had a great successful trip to Germany. And among the changes they said, instead of saying Sieg Heil, they started saying Free America. And they would, which had the same cadence. And they certainly raised their arms, in the salute, the Nazi salute. But yeah, for the most part, the Nazis really kept them at arm's length.
Okay. Bess, I've got several people asking how we can read or see your play, which is lovely. Are we hoping that it'll come to a theater near us sometime soon?
Yes, we are. I think it will be coming at least to New York in the next year or so, and then hopefully to a theater near you, because I know we have people on this from around the world. So yes, hopefully you will be seeing it. London was the beginning, but hoping it's coming to New York.
Fantastic. And for those watching, we have put all the information about all of both Bess's play and our author's books in the chat. So please make sure to take a look, because all the detail is there in terms of the names of the books and everything else, because I know everybody wants to know. There is, though, a question here. Besides the work that the three of you have done, is there additional research or a particular either book or anything else that you guys have relied on or that you recommend for people who want even more information after we're done here today? Arnie?
If the FBI has what's called the Vault, and they have all the files on Fritz Kuhn and all the files on the German-American Bund. And they are both fascinating and deadly dull at the same time. One of the files is just nothing but redacted names. They stood outside, one of the camps and wrote down, car license plate things, and it's all redacted. So that's one resource. Also, you can find on the Internet Archive, you can find the testimony from Fritz Kuhn, from Helen Voorhees, and from other people when they spoke to, it wasn't HUAC then, it was something else, but what became HUAC.
Brad, anything that you would recommend for folks to take a look at if they're interested in more?
Yeah, no, those are all great resources. I mean, there's a few recent books that have come out. I think, we're living through a golden age of this kind of history. I mean, people are discovering this. There's a lot being written. A professor at Boston University, Charles Gallagher, has a book that came out about a month ago called The Nazis of Copley Square, talking about the Christian Front, which was an adjacent organization. Right. But I suspect that we are going to see a number of publications. I certainly am still actively researching this material, so yeah, there'll be a lot coming out.
Fantastic. Well, I cannot thank the three of you enough. This has been a fascinating conversation, and it went by awfully quickly. I feel like we could have talked for a whole nother hour, but I'm so grateful to all of you. So thank you for your time and your efforts and your knowledge. I'm going to turn the program back over to Sydney, and thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to echo what Randi has said. This was such an amazing conversation. We're getting so many great comments in the chat. And Brad, it's actually funny that you mentioned Father Gallagher's book, because we're actually doing a program with him soon. So you all should check that out. So yeah, I would like to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Randi, again. And I would also like to thank the New York City College of Technology and the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County again for co-presenting today's program. Everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. To those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, including our other ones about Nazis in America, which you can check out at the links in the Zoom chat. Have a great afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And thank you again to all our panelists and to our moderator. This was really great.